Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Chef. Good afternoon. I'm speaking from Adelaide, and I want to acknowledge the Kaurna people, the original custodians of the Adelaide Plains, and I wish to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and future. Okay, we are looking at Edward Walter Wickes, and I'm looking at it in two ways: the transformation of his career through his literacy and his capacity to write, and the transformation of our understanding of his career through the digitisation of Australian colonial newspapers through Trove. So, as a quick introduction, digital transformation of Australia's colonial newspapers. We can now research pages of text and images online rather than relying upon microfilm, microfiche, or original copies. And access to digital copies of newspapers expand our appreciation of literacy levels that help colonial men and women to transform their working lives and their private social status. So through those newspapers, we can look at advertisements and reports in South Australian newspapers that can help enhance our understanding of the careers of a man like Wickes and the way in which his literacy supported his transformation from a classroom teacher to a government bureaucrat. And the writing of school textbooks that he promoted his competence as a teacher, secured a position as a government official, and enhanced his social status. And he was therefore able to gain a reliable salary and enhance his cultural and social status in Adelaide. Now, very quick introductions and overviews. There's a bit to go through here, but I'll try and make it as fast as possible. There is a tradition of teacher authors who produce school textbooks. This is transferred from late 18th century Britain. The most obvious example is Richmond Mugnall, a woman who also wrote a school and produced a series of books that were still in print well into the 19th century. The colonial capital of Adelaide became a centre for book selling, printing, publishing, and teacher authors. Some of these teacher authors produced school textbooks. Others concentrated on journalism, fiction, and non-fiction. There is also the potential for colonial teachers to become bureaucrats. Noticeably, Script and Print once had an article on John Ray, who became a colonial official in the city of Sydney. Digitised newspapers give us a flavour of this in advertising. James McGowan had advertising for his teaching work at the same time as his school books. James Bonwick, who would eventually go on to colonial Victoria, his books were being produced and sold in colonial Adelaide through Platt's book warehouses. And you get some booksellers such as Platt's who would sell both British books and, if you look down, Bonwick's Australian Geography at the same time. So they're selling a mixture of books from different sources. So Wickes, he's a teacher, a head teacher, a school proprietor, a school textbook author, and an administrator. He developed private venture schools, and one sidebar to this, a private venture school is a private school, no government subsidy. There is no board of governors or corporate structure. It is a business, and it is meant to produce a living, preferably a profit, for the owner who sets it up. They can also be bought and sold and inherited. He's also found in government records as a result of his entry into the government support for schools. He becomes a member of the Central Board of Education, which was the first government body to work with setting up government schools before a formal education department, and he becomes a bureaucrat as their secretary during the 1850s and 1860s. And here is the gentleman himself at the end of his life. Right, career transformation, which relies upon cultural transfer and cultural transmission throughout the British Empire, and also in some cases from the United States to Australia. They transfer the idea of writing school books from Britain, and sometimes they would follow British models. We also have to look at educational history during the long 19th century and colonial South Australia in terms of the desire for cultural capital and social agency. Quick overview of the historiography. You've got three main transitions. Post-war liberal accounts, which tend to cast the development of government support for education as the state acting for the common good and continuous progress. The revisionist accounts from the mid-1970s onwards, often known as the Adelaide School, which begins to reevaluate the growth of government schooling in terms of class and gender. In essence, an Adelaide elite trying to develop working class education to improve social behaviour or maintain social behaviour, employment markets, and move towards industrialisation in South Australia. From the mid to late 1980s, more a re-examination of liberal and revisionist accounts, post-structuralism, postmodernism, looking at micro-narratives and a greater influence on cultural capital and social agency. So, Wickes is initially part of private venture school education in South Australia. You get two trends here, the post-war liberal accounts and the impact of free, compulsory and secular elementary education on these private venture schools, which were always financially fragile, could come and go. Alternatively, we're beginning to look from the early 1970s, Marge Theobald, Helen Reid and co, who look at these private venture schools and say that sometimes they can provide innovative curriculum options and access to elite social networks. In essence, the people who run these schools are entrepreneurial, cultural promoters, risk takers, prepared to engage in advertising. Just a bit more in terms of the historiography. South Australia was free of convict transportation. The colonists, the elite colonists, regarding it more as a province of England rather than a colony. The political and economic forces that drive South Australia are Adelaide-based. And there is a desire to form government support for education from less affluent families linked on maintaining Adelaide as a more culturally elevated settlement. They are looking at work. South Australia goes through terrible boom-bust economic cycles, often based on mining that would collapse and the seasonal impact on agricultural crops. So there is this push to ally public schooling or publicly supported schooling to the development of an industrial base, particularly in Adelaide. So not only does it concentrate on Adelaide, but there is a concentration on a particular section of Adelaide. Down King William Street, which runs down the centre, Victoria Square in the middle of the town through to North Terrace. Very quickly on school books. There is a battery of knowledge on school book publication and selling in colonial Australia. It's usually linked to importation, some local authors, government endorsement, and it also tends to look at cultural transmission within the British Empire, the use of school books to shape morality, the use of school books and their impact on curriculum, the formation of an Australian identity during the late colonial period, and the formation of gender identity. Cultural history in South Australia, there has been quite a lot of work, once again, elevating Adelaide above the convict settlements, there is an importance of newspaper publishing to transmit information, advertising for cultural events and materials, and also this notion of cultural consumption in Adelaide as a means of elevating your social position and your social networks. Of course, that also links up to the broader British Empire, North American 19th century, from late 18th century to 19th century, British cultural consumption. And I always turn to people like John Brewer and Tony Bennett for the exhibitionary complex. This notion, you can also tuck in with theory Jürgen Habermas, the associational world, civil society, Pierre Bourdieu. The impact of Trove, and the other mention is that you get ministers of education in the 1870s who were actually linked to the newspaper trade in Adelaide. Trove gives us much more information about educational markets and cultural consumption. So let's get back to Wickes. He lives and at one point taught in a school for boys for prosperous families in North Adelaide. So he starts teaching for the prosperous. This is within walking distance of the Adelaide Central Business District. His writing skills, however, help him to transform his life and make this jump from being a private school head teacher to entering the emerging South Australian government bureaucracy. He also develops commercial links with printers, publishers, booksellers and stationers who operate in King William Street. Just to give you an idea, this is a view of King William Street in 1865. It's taken from the Town Hall Tower. It's looking north. So right at the end of that road, you get North Adelaide. Everything's within walking distance. In the middle distance, you will have the intersection of King William Street and North Terrace. So this becomes Wickes' world once he begins to enter into government bureaucracy. On the left, you have the first South Australian Government House, still standing, still being used by the government. On the right, you have the early government administration buildings in Victoria Square, still in existence, now being used as hotel accommodation. You have with the intersection of North Terrace, on the eastern side, you have the South Australian Institute, and not surprisingly, because that newspaper text on the right indicates this, Wickes becomes a member of the South Australian Institute. This is the founding institution for the South Australian Library, which is the new part is now located in behind that building, the South Australian Museum and the South Australian Art Gallery. And a block down, the intersection just before North Terrace, you have the intersection of King William Street, Hindley Street on the west, and Rundle Street, now Rundle Mall, on the east. And that is your centre for booksellers, printers, publishers. On the left, Platt's Warehouse. We saw the earlier advertisements. He's the leading bookseller. There are many, but he is one of the central figures. And on the right, Rigby Books. And for those of you who remember school books from the 20th century, they went on to be a major school book publisher. Okay, he was born in England, trained at Stepney College, or wanted to train at Stepney College, wanted to become a preacher. Financial circumstances, a widowed mother, means he turns to teaching at 19. He apparently begins writing school books in England. He leaves for South Australia. He begins running a school for young gentlemen and starts with a partnership and then becomes a sole proprietor. Trove means that we can now look at his advertising for his schools. That's the one with his partner Tetherington, who was a minister, and then Hill House. The text is actually interesting because it praises the quality of his school, but within that particular article, it also notes that these schools were particularly vulnerable in terms of finances. He also dips his toes into the commercial sphere by becoming involved in that society, building society, not noted in any educational history. It's something you pick up on Trove nowadays. So 1847, you get the official government ordinance supporting funding for schools. Then the formation of the central board, either an individual or a small community group say, we're forming a school, can you give us a license and a stipend? That means the implementation of the central board with an inspector and then the secretary to do the paperwork and regular board meetings. So once he becomes the secretary, he is dealing with a huge amount of administrative paperwork, licenses, resignations, buildings and the like. And at the same time, he begins writing a series of school textbooks for school children from working class families in little short books that can be picked up and used within these emerging government schools. So this is the sort of material that's being produced in newspapers. It means we can look at that now as opposed to having to go out to state records and looking at the original minutes, either on microfilm or in the minute books. He is now earning regularly over £200 a year. He's working incredibly hard for that, however. And he's always under public scrutiny because meetings of the central board are always being published. It would be tempting to say he virtually worked himself into the ground. He had to retire due to ill health. He is so highly thought of. He receives a testimonial, tributes at his death, wide range of teaching compatriots who pay tribute to him. He starts within the nonconformist area, and South Australia is regarded as the paradise for dissenters or nonconformists, but he becomes strongly linked with the Church of England, who really are the sort of dominant force in terms of social circles in Adelaide, and he eventually dies at his residence in North Adelaide. This is the sort of tribute material that you find in the press. Here's a list of some of his books. He rarely, if ever, and I mean, I have yet to find anything that's too dramatic. It is very rare to find anybody who speaks against him. There might have been some tensions about his geography book, because at the same time because this is a very, it's supposed to be a secular board, but there's a Protestant flavour about it, and there was a geography book produced by Julian Tennyson Woods, who was an associate of Mother Mary MacKillop. So there might have been some tensions around that, but in general, he just keeps producing these books on top of the meetings, on top of all the paperwork. To my knowledge, he only ever had one clerk at times. This is a quick reproduction from my PhD thesis. The reason I included is the importance of paratext with these books. I'm not going to give you an analysis of the actual internals of the grammar book. They tend to be fairly simple and straightforward across the board. What I find fascinating when you're linking it to the newspapers is the paratext. His printer and David Gall's successors took over these books and kept printing them out, and the fact that on the back of the book, because this has been opened up, on the back of the book you get the list of his other books, so it's acting as a promotion for not only the printer but the other books in the series. And of course with Trove you can look at the advertising in the press and link it to the advertising or the promotional material on the book in the paratext. Although these cheap books were produced for fairly small cost in terms of the purchase, often by school teachers, one copy through one of our noted antiquarian booksellers in Adelaide now retails for $250. Why are they producing these books? The rule of thumb, if you go back to Gibbs' PhD thesis, is that teacher authors producing school textbooks usually didn't expect to make too much money. So why are they spending so much time? particularly when they're juggling it with so many other duties. McGowan, who was a predecessor of Wickes in Adelaide, sort of indicated fairly neatly in one of his advertisements, it indicates your sense of professionalism during a period before teacher training colleges. We did have a sort of de facto normal school in South Australia. That's the North American tradition. But that was not a formal or large-scale operation at all. If you've got a book, it means you're a potential professional, even though you may not have formal teacher training qualifications, which really don't kick in South Australia until the late 1870s. So, heading towards the conclusion, the factors that prompt a teacher author, the impact of cultural consumption, access to school textbook advertising. It's now easier to link paratext to a textbook and newspaper advertising. The financial incentives were negligible, but it shows that by having a book published as a teacher author, it proves or is a means to show your cultural capital, potentially boost your social agency and your social capital, and that links up with digitised newspapers, because you are then able to access references to the meetings and the functions attended by teacher authors. Wickes went to Government House, and to understand their career transformation. So other than my selected references, if anybody wants to get to them, I think I'll leave it at that. Over to you, Dennis. Thank you, everybody.